The sound of the band ripples through the narrow streets and centuries-old buildings in the French Quarter. There is no mistaking this place, New Orleans, Louisiana. Standing on the sidewalk outside the landmark Café du Monde, they played for tips. The music, coupled with the aroma of chicory coffee and beignets, those tasty fried dough and powdered sugar treats, blended together in perfect harmony. Just a few blocks away, a trolley car rambles down Canal Street. And for a young man sitting on a dirty street, his instruments of choice are plastic buckets. This is the New Orleans we all know, its sights and sounds and smells. Its culture and character stemming from the French colonists who founded the city in the very early 1700s. But beyond the city, there is, in southern Louisiana, in the bayous and bays, and along the Mississippi River Delta, a very different reality. Just to look at it, you can't see it. But steadily, constantly, and over decades, Louisiana has been shrinking. Coastal wetlands simply disappearing.
What we want to compare.
Ehab Masali is a professor of river coastal science at Tulane University.
How would you characterize the condition it's in?
I would say, if I have to choose one word, I would say it's very fragile. Because the conditions that we are in are not necessarily supportive or conducive for a healthy, strong, resilient ecosystem.
The conditions are so bad, scientists say that every 100 minutes, wetlands the size of a football field vanish, replaced by the waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
It needs to cure.
James Karst is communications director for the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana.
That's what coastal land loss is. A place where there used to be vegetation, there used to be soft, squishy land that you could walk on. It's now open water with no vegetation on it. And Louisiana has lost about 2,000 square miles of those wetlands in less than a century.
So what happened? What brought on this calamity? Well, we, humans, did most of the damage. The mighty Mississippi River flows more than 2,000 miles from the state of Minnesota, south, right through Louisiana, to the Gulf of Mexico.
One of the fundamental causes of coastal land loss is the very strict leveeing of the Mississippi River, which has prevented the periodic introduction of sediment and fresh water into our wetlands.
Without the fresh water, the wetlands die. Without the sediment deposits, there are no life-sustaining nutrients. And without the sediment building up year after year, decade after decade, no new land is created. The leveeing of the river began with the first plantation owners. Then a flood in 1927 escalated the process.
And at that point, the Army Corps of Engineers began building a very strict levee all the way down the river, and that allowed communities to develop and to thrive.
The levee system of man-made walls kept the Mississippi from going where people didn't want it to go. But that completely changed the natural process. The river no longer overflowed its banks, spreading fresh water and sediment out into the marshes. The sediment simply washed straight downriver into the Gulf. On top of that, canals and channels were cut through the wetlands for shipping and oil and gas. Environmental consequences were ignored or not understood.
So all these are remnant oil and gas canals. You can tell that they are not natural.
With the wetlands in a fragile and declining condition, as Ehab Masali says, naturally occurring events like hurricanes take a greater toll, eating away even more land.
The system being stressed and fragile and not very resilient makes it more susceptible to the forces of these the events that actually are part of nature, because hurricanes have always been there. So the system could have been much more resilient if it was healthy and strong, and it faces a hurricane, no problem, it will recover.
So this is where people like Francisca Troutman have stepped up to try and make a difference. Do something, anything that might help.
What are we looking at?
So this is our mixed mountain of glass. This is basically where all of the colors of glass, most of them end up here.
This is the 40,000 square foot facility of the company Glass Half Full, where glass bottles are turned into glass sand for coastal restoration.
Glass from the mountain will be scooped up by a front end loader. We'll put it into our pulverizing system, and then it'll go up the conveyor belt where it'll reach the hammer mills. It'll be crushed up, and all the non-glass pieces will be separated at that point. So labels, caps, corks, anything that's not glass will come out. And then the rest will be sent up to the sifter. And then it'll be separated into 3 sizes.
The glass is then bagged and tagged to identify the sizes of the glass sand from very fine to coarse. Of course, the operation didn't start out this way. A few years ago, in 2020, Troutman, then a senior chemical engineering student at Tulane University in New Orleans, and her business partner were drinking a bottle of wine and thinking how that bottle would just end up in a landfill.
You had to know going in. This is a big deal. This is a daunting task.
No, that's the thing. We had no idea. We were so naive. We thought it would be a cute little backyard project, easy, fun, simple, and we just started. And I think that's why we were able to be so successful early on, is because we didn't think about those things. We didn't think about this huge issue of glass recycling and coastal restoration. We just wanted to be a part of the solution and do something, however small that something was.
In fact, the company started with a small pulverizer in a friend's backyard.
In their first year of operation, Glass Half Full collected 600,000 pounds of glass. Now, that seems like a lot, but consider where it is now. 3.5 million pounds of glass every year.
Truckloads of bottles in bins are delivered from bars, restaurants, hotels, and casinos. People come by the facility dropping off boxes filled with bottles.
Oh, it's a big deal, yeah, and I like what they're doing.
In one pilot project, biodegradable burlap bags filled with glass sand were used to construct a wall around a damaged marsh. Native vegetation was planted behind the wall and appears to be taking hold and filling in. Positive results.
Did it surprise you how quickly nature adapted and got back to the way it was?
Yes, it's very surprising. Someone on my TikTok even commented, it's like you gave the coast a little Band-Aid, and that's all it needed, you know, a little Band-Aid, and then it healed itself.
Where does it go next? What do you do now?
We keep dreaming. We hope to continue expanding Glass Half Full to areas that don't have glass recycling, and also areas that might have coastal erosion and need sediment for restoration projects.
For Troutman, the work they do satisfies 2 needs: keeping mountains of glass from going to landfills and helping to restore the wetlands.
So where does some of the sand glass from Glass Half Full end up? Right here in this greenhouse at Tulane University Research Facility.
Here, researchers are working to determine how native vegetation grows in the different textures of glass sand, or in what's called restoration mix, consisting of glass sand and Mississippi River sand. These native bald cypress trees are showing promise, growing nicely in the restoration mix.
In order to determine whether or not using glass sand is a viable restoration method, we have to see how does it compare to the current restoration methods.
And those are using dredged sand from the Mississippi.
Exactly, those are using dredged sand from the Mississippi.
How many oysters do you think you've shucked, Lil?
What about 2 million?
How many have you shucked?
Probably 2 million.
2 million?
2 million.
Oysters, fried, baked, or on the half shell like these, are harvested by the millions in Louisiana waters in the Gulf of Mexico. But the shells, like glass bottles, end up, you probably guessed it, in landfills.
Oyster shells going to a landfill? That's ridiculous.
Dickie Brennan owns the Bourbon House restaurant in New Orleans. A decade ago, it hit him. There had to be an alternative to landfills. Brennan, along with the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, began to collect and recycle all the shells from restaurants and bars and hotels.
We'll do 1 million oysters a year.
1 million a year.
This restaurant has recycled coming up on 800 tons of oyster shells.
And that's over the course of how many years?
Since 2014. So, I mean, that would have gone to a landfill, and now it's, going back into where it should.
Where they should be, in the water. But first, they come here. Tens of millions of oyster shells are cured in the sun to kill bacteria.
That's a bag of oyster shell?
Yeah. Then volunteers packed them in mesh sacks. Some of the sacks ended up here.
Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana built a oyster shell barrier around this site.
We rode with Captain Richie Blink out to a reef made of oyster shells.
So we're coming up to the Lemon Tree site, and so this is an indigenous site, right? And there's been occupation here since at least the year 1100, but there could have been 2,000 years of occupation here, right? And what's going on over the last 10 years, much of this site has been eroded away.
It is amazing to see an oyster shell reef built to protect and restore this vanishing spit of wetlands. All around it, water, shrimp boats in the distance. But here, the land, the vegetation, is filling back in behind the reef.
To me, it is a magical thing to be building an oyster reef and protecting a mound and going back after a hurricane, going back after Hurricane Ida and seeing that it survived. And not only did it survive, but it slowed erosion there. Like, erosion did not occur as rapidly there as it did to a place right next door where there is no oyster reef.
These are all smaller, volunteer-driven efforts. Important, but certainly not the answer. The state of Louisiana has a master plan. More than 70 projects costing tens of billions of dollars over the next several decades. Ground was recently broken on a project to install massive gates on a flood protection levee. When open, the gates will divert sediment-rich water into a channel, gradually creating new land. If this and other projects work, land loss will be slowed. But the bottom line, it can't be stopped.
If they are under the impression that we will reverse land loss, and that doesn't happen, that's not good.
And it won't happen.
It will not happen, so why? I don't think that anybody is saying that, but not saying it, some people may assume that if we spend $2 billion or $10 billion or $50 billion that we will reverse it. We will not reverse it. We will slow it.
But the alternative, doing nothing and watching their land disappear, is not something the people of Louisiana will accept.
I have faith. I'm hopeful.
I have an obsession with trying to shore up these places before it's too late.
I think there's always hope for us to turn things around, make it better, stop the bad things from happening.
These folks will tell you there were way too many years of foot dragging and inaction. At least now there is a plan, a genuine sense of urgency, and there is hope.